A spoiled son, driven by greed and a sense of entitlement, schemed to frame his own mother, sending her to prison for many years. Believing that with her out of the way, he would inherit her fortune, he revelled in his newfound freedom, living lavishly and thinking he had escaped consequence. However, when the time came for him to collect the inheritance, he found himself met with a shocking twist. "I said, bring another round, or get me your manager," Brandon demanded, his voice slurring slightly as he waved his empty glass at the waiter. "Sir, I brought the bill for the previous drinks. When you switched tables, I had to start a new order," the waiter explained patiently, glancing nervously at Brandon's empty shot glass. Brandon clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated, and took a deep breath before speaking. "Listen, just bring me another round of tequilas and don't make me lose it. I'm trying to have a good time here." The waiter hesitated, then replied, "Sir, one moment please. Let me get the manager." Brandon, just 22 and a recent college dropout, was on a mission to make an impression. The pulsing beats of the club music matched his heartbeat as he scanned the room, eyeing the girls dancing under the neon lights. He wanted more than just another round of drinks. He wanted to impress everyone around him, but most of all, he wanted Alex's attention. The crowd around him was lively, dancing and laughing. Brandon attempted to join them, staggering onto the dance floor and catching Alex's eye as he tried to keep up with the rhythm. He could feel the alcohol clouding his balance, his feet unsteady beneath him. After a few clumsy moves, he caught sight of Alex stifling a laugh, and embarrassment washed over him. Defeated, he stumbled back to the leather sofa in the corner. 10 minutes later, the waiter returned with a tray of tequilas, the manager following closely behind. They paused when they saw Brandon, now slouched over the table, eyes half closed, barely able to keep himself upright. The manager reached out, stopping the waiter mid-step. "I think he's had enough for tonight," the manager muttered, raising an eyebrow at the young man sprawled out on the sofa. A few moments later, the girls returned to their seats, laughing and chatting as they plopped down around Brandon. They took one look at him, nearly passed out, and broke into giggles. "Hey, Brandon!" Alex teased, nudging his shoulder. "I thought you said you could last longer than that. How exactly are you planning on impressing me?" She raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a playful grin. Groggy Brandon stirred and, in a last-ditch attempt to look cool, sat up and shouted, "Another round for us." But his slurred voice only made the girls laugh harder, amused at his over-the-top bravado. Apart from the security guards and staff, there was one other person in the bar who seemed out of place: Mrs. Jennifer Callahan. She had been sitting quietly at a small table in the corner for over 2 hours, observing the lively scene without getting involved. When a waitress had offered her a drink earlier, Jennifer had only asked for a glass of orange juice, thanking her politely. Jennifer, dressed in a neat blouse and cardigan, stood out among the crowd of younger patrons, drawing glances and whispers. A group of college students, tipsy and stumbling as they made their way to the bar, noticed her. One of the guys squinted, surprised to see someone like her in a place like this. Turning to his friends, he muttered with a smirk, "Whose mum is that? Shouldn't she be home, maybe babysitting her grandkids or something?" Jennifer didn't hear the comment, but the bartender did. He watched the group chuckle and drift away, and after a moment he picked up a clean glass and made his way over to her table. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently, leaning over slightly so she could hear him over the music. "I don't mean to intrude, and it's none of my business, but I get the feeling you're not here for a night out." Jennifer looked up, taken aback at first, but then offered him a warm smile. She could tell he was speaking out of genuine concern. "You're right," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the bass thumping through the bar. "I'm not here to party, although, if the music wasn't so loud, I might actually enjoy the place." She chuckled, then paused, looking out toward the crowd before meeting his eyes again. "I know I'll sound like an overprotective mom, but I'm here to watch over my son. He's all I have. I just don't want him getting into trouble." The bartender nodded, understanding immediately. "I get it. He's lucky to have you looking out for him." She smiled, touched by his words. "Thank you. Sometimes I wonder if he feels the same." Just then, a loud cheer erupted from the other side of the bar. Jennifer glanced over to see Brandon, her son, still making a spectacle of himself, trying to order more drinks as his friends doubled over with laughter. She sighed but softened as she looked back at the bartender. "He just has a bit of growing up to do," she said with a small, hopeful smile. "But I'll be here for him, even if he doesn't realize it yet." The bartender gave her a nod. "I think he'll come around. You being here says more than he might understand right now." Meanwhile, Brandon stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, hoping it would snap him out of his haze. He stared at his reflection, feeling slightly more refreshed, and returned to the table brimming with newfound energy. "Let's go. We're hitting a nightclub," he announced with a grin. "There's a new place downtown, super exclusive. Come on, hurry up." As he bent down to grab his phone and car keys from the glass table, one of the girls, Tiffany, who still had a bit of caution in her voice, spoke up. "I don't mind going to the nightclub," she said, glancing at him with a raised eyebrow. "But we need to call a taxi. I'm not getting in your car, Brandon. I'm sorry." Brandon shot her an annoyed look, his ego bruised. "You think I can't drive? If you're scared, go ahead and take a taxi. But I'm driving my car," he replied stubbornly, holding on to his keys. Just then, a voice from behind cut through the tension, soft yet firm. "Brandon, honey, please take a taxi." Brandon froze, instantly recognizing his mother's voice. Jennifer stood there, her expression a mix of love and concern, but with that familiar sternness that meant she wasn't taking no for an answer. Brandon felt his cheeks flush, especially with Alex and the others watching. In front of Alex, he was the confident, independent guy, and here was his mom telling him what to do. It chipped away at the image he was trying so hard to maintain. He straightened, turning to face her with forced calm. "Hey, Mother," he said, emphasizing the word in an almost mocking tone. "What are you doing here?" Jennifer's face softened, but she didn't back down. She knew this tone. He'd adopted it ever since he'd started seeing himself as grown up and had made a point of calling her mother instead of mom, especially in public. "I'm here because I care about you, Brandon," she said, her eyes meeting his steadily. "And I'm not going to let you do something reckless just to impress a few people." Tiffany chimed in gently. "Come on, Brandon. We can all just take a taxi. It'll be more fun anyway." Lately, Jennifer couldn't help but notice how much Brandon was starting to resemble his father, Donald. The same stubbornness, the same tendency to take things for granted. Donald had been a couch potato, content to sit around doing nothing, watching TV and spending his nights with friends at bars. When Brandon was 5, Jennifer had reached her breaking point. She couldn't bear Donald's lack of ambition and indifference anymore. She'd asked him to leave, hoping it would be a wake-up call. Instead, he left quietly, almost relieved to be free from responsibility. Brandon, however, had always felt Jennifer was the reason he grew up without a father. As he got older, he seemed to act out almost as if in revenge, blaming her for his father's absence and punishing her with his rebellious attitude. Once, after a particularly heated argument, he threw her sacrifices back in her face. "If Dad had been around," he'd said angrily, "maybe I wouldn't have felt so alone growing up. Maybe things wouldn't have been so empty." Jennifer felt the sting of his words like a slap. She had done everything she could to make sure he had what he needed, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort and dreams. But Brandon couldn't see it that way. He'd cast himself as the victim, preferring to see her as the villain. Trying to make him understand, she replied gently, "Son, if you think you were lonely because I kicked your father out, then why didn't he ever visit? Why didn't he ever try to find you?" Brandon's face flushed with anger, and he spat back, "Because you told him never to show up at our door, that's why." He stormed out before she could respond, leaving her standing there, hurt and frustrated. Jennifer realized then that he wasn't ready to hear the truth. He was still clinging to an idealized version of his father and wasn't willing to let go of it. In reality, Donald had never wanted a family or any real commitment. It wasn't that he was lost or struggling. He simply didn't want to put in the effort to build a life. While Jennifer had worked as a stay-at-home truck dispatcher, balancing her job with caring for little Brandon, Donald had spent his days lounging on the couch or drinking beer. She'd tried to reason with him, asking him repeatedly if this was how he wanted to live, if he was happy with their life as it was. Each time he'd shrugged and mumbled something non-committal, perfectly content with his empty routine. When she'd finally confronted him, asking him to step up or leave, Donald had simply looked at her and said, "I'm fine with things as they are. Why can't you be?" Now, all these years later, Brandon only saw the absence, not the reasons behind it. Jennifer watched him, her heart aching, knowing he'd need time to come to terms with his father's choices. She only hoped that one day he would understand that everything she had done was to give him the best life she could. "Brandon, give me the keys, please," Jennifer said softly, looking directly into her son's eyes. She could see the silent plea in them, the unspoken request not to embarrass him here, not in front of his friends. She loved him deeply, but she knew that her unwavering devotion had left him spoiled, used to her always bending for him. This time, however, she couldn't. "Mom, just go home, all right?" Brandon's voice grew sharp, each word dripping with irritation. Jennifer held her ground. "I'll leave once I know my son is safe and not getting behind the wheel drunk." Brandon felt a flash of anger as he noticed Alex smirking at the exchange, as if amused by the spectacle. His face grew red with frustration, and he snapped, "Why are you stalking me all the time? Why can't you just leave me alone? I'm sick of you." He stormed out of the bar, shoving the door open and striding to his car, a car Jennifer had given him for his 20th birthday, a fact he rarely seemed to acknowledge. Desperate, Jennifer hurried after him, watching him unlock the car door and slide behind the wheel. Just as he was about to pull away, she ran around and jumped into the passenger seat before he could stop her. "Brandon, stop! You're not in any state to drive," she pleaded, her voice steady but laced with worry. Ignoring her, he clenched his jaw, revved the engine and sped onto the highway. He glared at the road ahead, barely able to keep the car steady. "Why can't you be like everyone else's mom? You're such a freak. Always hovering, always judging." "Brandon, pull over. You're drunk, and you're going to hurt someone." Jennifer's voice rose, her fear evident. "Get the hell out. I don't want to see you anymore," he shouted, barely glancing her way as he swerved between cars. "I'm so tired of seeing your face." Jennifer sat silently, her heart sinking. His words felt like a knife, each one cutting deeper than the last. Maybe he was right, she thought bitterly. Maybe it was time to let go and stop trying to protect him. He was 23 now, old enough to face the consequences of his actions. She took a steadying breath, deciding to reason with him one last time. "Brandon," she began quietly, "please just pull—" A sudden loud thump interrupted her words, and the car jolted to a stop. Brandon froze, his hands gripping the wheel, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. His eyes were wide, his earlier defiance replaced by a sickening wave of fear. Jennifer's heart pounded, her own fears momentarily forgotten as she watched the shock settle over her son's face. "Mom, I think I hit someone," Brandon whispered, his voice trembling. Jennifer's heart dropped. She screamed, fumbling with the door handle before stumbling out of the car. On the ground, an old man lay motionless near the intersection. It looked like Brandon had clipped him with the bumper while attempting a reckless right turn. One glance at the man's pale, still face told her everything. There wasn't much they could do. Jennifer's hands shook as she quickly dialed 911. "Mom!" Brandon called out, his voice filled with dread. "What are we going to do now?" Jennifer's eyes didn't leave the man as she replied quietly, "There's nothing we can do, except wait." In the distance, the faint wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the ambulance and police. Jennifer glanced back at Brandon, who looked oddly composed despite what had just happened. "Mom, can you get me my cigarettes?" he asked, almost too casually. "They should be on the dashboard." Jennifer's mind felt hazy, and without thinking, she nodded, trying to distract herself from the chaos surrounding them. She slipped back into the driver's seat, mechanically searching for the cigarette pack. Her hands swept the dashboard, her mind swirling with confusion and fear. "Where is it?" she muttered, her voice strained. "I don't see it, Brandon." No. She leaned over, checking under the seat and in the glove compartment, desperately trying to keep herself occupied until the flashing lights of the ambulance and police car surrounded them. As the officers and paramedics attended to the old man, Jennifer tried to collect her thoughts. Her heart sank when she saw one paramedic shake his head grimly, confirming the worst. Two officers approached the car, stopping right in front of Jennifer. One of them exchanged a look with his partner. "She's probably going to be charged with reckless driving," he murmured. Jennifer's head snapped up, her mind reeling. "Wait, what do you mean, me?" She looked over at Brandon, utterly confused. To her shock, Brandon was standing with another officer, his face twisted into a sad, almost pitiful expression as he began talking. "Yeah, I was in the passenger seat," he said, his voice steady. "My mum was driving, and I kept telling her to pay attention, to slow down. I didn't want her driving like that, but she wouldn't listen." Jennifer's eyes widened, horror creeping over her as she listened to his fabricated story. "It's my car, but she insisted on driving. I was so worried," Brandon continued, sounding distressed. "I kept saying, 'Mum, please watch the road.' She was just not listening. I don't think she even noticed the man until it was too late." Jennifer's voice trembled with shock as she looked at her son. Brandon looked back at her with a hollow smile, a hint of regret in his eyes, but he held his ground. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. One of the officers stepped forward, motioning Jennifer to stay in the car as they processed Brandon's statement. She stared at him, disbelief turning to heartbreak as she realized the weight of what he was doing. Her own son was willing to let her take the fall, to twist the truth to save himself. "Brandon?" she whispered, her voice breaking. But he had already turned his back, speaking to the officer, leaving her alone to face the consequences. She closed her eyes, the betrayal cutting deeper than any punishment could. Jennifer had a choice, a chance to save herself. She could have told the officers the truth, revealed that her son was lying, that he had been driving the whole time. But as she looked at Brandon standing there, counting on her silence, she felt the weight of her love for him. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to betray him, even if it meant bearing the blame. A strange kind of mother's love, she thought bitterly. Jennifer never imagined that caring for her child would lead to such heartache. She had sacrificed so much to protect him, but this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. As Brandon continued speaking with the officers, recounting his fabricated version of events, Jennifer felt her strength drain. She sank to the ground, her body racked with silent sobs. She was exhausted, too tired to fight, and resigned to her fate. She let go of any hope of redemption, knowing she was about to bear the burden of her son's choices. "Mom, we're going to need you to sign a few papers," an officer said gently, extending a clipboard. Jennifer looked up at him through tear-filled eyes and nodded, her hands trembling as she signed her name. She didn't resist when they placed her in handcuffs and escorted her to the squad car. As she got in, an officer remarked, "I've never seen anyone so calm in a situation like this. Thank you for your cooperation, Ma'am. The court will take that into account." Jennifer simply nodded, staring blankly ahead. She felt numb, like she was drifting through a fog. Then came the trial. Jennifer sat in the courtroom, her face expressionless, barely hearing the words exchanged around her. She didn't even look up when Brandon took the stand, his voice steady as he testified against her. He spoke with a strange, almost gleeful tone, as if relieved to be avoiding jail time. Each word he uttered was another knife twisting in her heart, but she forced herself to remain still, to show no sign of the betrayal that threatened to tear her apart. When the verdict was read, 7 years in prison for reckless driving resulting in a pedestrian's death, Jennifer felt a hollowness consume her. She could barely hear the judge's words. Everything felt distant, muffled, as if she were underwater. The courtroom faded into a blur, voices fading into echoes. As she was led away, Jennifer's mind was empty, a vast void where love and hope had once lived. She had given everything for Brandon, and now there was nothing left. 2 years passed, and Brandon hadn't visited his mother even once. Jennifer no longer expected him to. She had long since made peace with the fact that she no longer had a son. The boy she had raised, protected, and sacrificed for had vanished the day he chose to let her take the fall. At Jennifer's request, her friend Cindy had sold her small dispatching company. A portion of the sale went to the victim's family as compensation, and the rest was deposited in Jennifer's bank account, untouched. Cindy was Jennifer's one remaining connection to the outside world, her only visitor. Every few weeks, Cindy would sit across from Jennifer, both determined and distressed, frustrated by the fact that Jennifer was still being held in the general population despite her worsening health. Prison life had eroded any will Jennifer had left. She had fallen off the face of the earth, it seemed, forgotten by everyone but Cindy. The first days in her cell she spent grappling with the weight of her choices, her mind racing with unanswerable questions. Why had it come to this? Why had she sacrificed everything for a son who had betrayed her? Some nights, she longed for release, a quiet escape from the endless ache. She thought about disappearing for good, slipping away into nothingness. During one of Cindy's visits, after hours of gentle coaxing and deep conversation, Jennifer finally broke down and confided the truth. She told Cindy everything, the lies Brandon had told, the way he had manipulated the situation to protect himself, and the heartbreaking moment she chose to stay silent for him. Cindy listened, stunned and heartbroken. The story of Jennifer's blind sacrifice for a son who had abandoned her stirred something fierce within her. As Cindy learned more about the troubled relationship between Jennifer and Brandon, her heartbreak turned to outrage. She knew Jennifer deserved justice, and without Jennifer's knowledge, Cindy decided to fight to bring the case back to light. Ironically, Cindy discovered a potential lifeline in an unexpected place. The prosecutor who had originally built the case against Jennifer, Larry Garcia, had since shifted his career. Now working as a defense attorney, Garcia was known for taking on cases he felt could right past wrongs. Determined to use every resource available, Cindy tracked down Garcia's contact information and reached out, explaining Jennifer's situation with passion and urgency. Unbeknownst to Jennifer, a process had begun, one that could finally bring the truth to light and grant her the justice she deserved. One day, Cindy visited Jennifer in prison, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Larry Garcia, the former prosecutor who had once fought to convict Jennifer. Jennifer's brow furrowed with confusion as she looked from Cindy to Larry, trying to make sense of his presence. Before Jennifer could ask, Cindy launched into an explanation, her tone leaving no room for interruption. "Jen, I've been working on this for months," she said, determination flashing in her eyes. "I'm not letting this go. It's wrong. Everything about this is wrong. I don't care if he's your son. It doesn't matter who he is. You don't deserve to be here, and I'm going to get you out." Jennifer sighed heavily, looking away, her gaze distant. When she finally met Larry's eyes, she spoke softly. "Why now? Why come back for me?" Larry offered her a calm, reassuring smile. "Jennifer, it's good to see you again. Only this time, I'm on your side." He sat down, his voice gentle yet resolute. "I've reviewed your case, and there are clear grounds for appeal. I believe we can get you out." Jennifer's expression remained stoic, tinged with indifference. So what? She murmured, her tone flat. I get released. And then what? I've lost everything. My business is gone. People who once knew me think I'm a deranged convict. What am I supposed to do? Tell everyone I was falsely imprisoned and that my own son is the one who should be here instead. Why would I want a life like that? She looked up at him, eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. Can you tell me why that's worth fighting for? Larry struggled to find the right words, surprised by her response. Well, it's freedom, Jennifer. Jennifer shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. Freedom? Freedom can be a lot worse than life here. Out there, everyone I know, everything I've built, it's all gone. People won't just accept me back. We can't undo the past. Nothing will go back to how it was. In fact, it might be even worse. Cindy placed a gentle hand on Jennifer's arm, her voice soft but firm. Jen, please. You still have people who care about you. Don't give up. You deserve a chance at a life, even if it's not the one you left behind. Larry leaned forward, his eyes searching Jennifer's face. Look, Jennifer, I know this is difficult. And you're right. It won't be the same. But I'll be here, just like Cindy. You don't have to face this alone. Over time, Larry became a familiar figure in Jennifer's life. He visited her more often than she expected, bringing updates on her case, talking through her fears, and simply listening. Gradually, she began to look forward to his visits, drawn to his unwavering support and quiet determination. Meanwhile, Brandon had managed to win over Alex's heart, and they had been living together for several years. Alex was drawn to Brandon's charm and confidence, but the mention of a substantial sum of money in his mother's bank account had made her all the more eager to be with him. Still, the fact that Brandon couldn't access the account yet sometimes troubled her. But it's not really your money, Brandon, Alex pointed out one evening, her tone a mix of curiosity and impatience. Brandon sighed, brushing off her concern. Alex, please. 7 years in prison? That's a long time. She's bound to have changed. I haven't heard from her in so long. I wouldn't be surprised if she wasn't even alive at this point. But you don't know that for sure, Alex replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. You don't know anything for certain. Brandon shrugged, waving his hand dismissively. It doesn't matter, Alex. I know my mother. She loves me so much, she'd hand over every last penny if she were here. You'll see. Alex tilted her head, a faint frown forming on her face. By the way, I never really understood how she got you into the passenger seat that night. You were furious when you stormed out of the bar. I remember watching you bolt toward the car like a rocket. Brandon felt a sudden wave of anxiety, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let her see any hint of the truth. Clearing his throat, he gave her a strained smile. You know, my mum, she's persuasive when she wants to be. I didn't have a choice, he said quickly. Thankfully, Alex seemed satisfied, nodding thoughtfully as Brandon discreetly wiped the sweat from his forehead. The truth was a risk he couldn't afford to take. If Alex ever found out, she'd leave him in an instant, and he knew it. He decided to wait a few more months before bringing up the inheritance again, letting the anticipation build. In his mind, it was only a matter of time before everything fell into place. Recently, Brandon had run into Cindy, his mother's former assistant and longtime friend. Cindy, once the vice president of his mother's dispatching company, had noticed Brandon first and intended to walk by without acknowledging him, but Brandon spotted her and approached with a casual air. Hey, Cindy, have you heard anything from my mom? He asked, feigning concern. Cindy paused, glancing at him with a raised eyebrow. Why are you asking about her all of a sudden? Her tone was laced with bitterness as she smirked, crossing her arms. Brandon shifted, trying to maintain his composure as his heart pounded. Well, she was supposed to be released by now. Her sentence is up. I'm just, worried. Prison's a harsh place. People can die in there. Cindy scoffed, unimpressed. Die? Is that what you're waiting for? She leaned in, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. You might as well consider her dead, Brandon. You'll never see her again in your life. Brandon frowned, trying to play dumb. What do you mean by consider her dead? Can you explain in simpler terms? Cindy's eyes flashed with barely contained anger. Oh, I can simplify it for you. She took a step closer, her voice now low and venomous. You're a piece of garbage, Brandon. A total coward who didn't even visit his mother once while she sat in prison for your crime. With that, Cindy turned on her heel and stormed off, her heart racing with pent-up frustration. She had barely restrained herself from saying worse, but she reminded herself that he didn't deserve an ounce of her energy. Meanwhile, a broad smile spread across Brandon's face as he watched her disappear. Cindy's reaction had told him exactly what he needed to hear. In his mind, his mother was either gravely ill or already dead. This meant he could finalize everything without interference. Confident, he began to set his plan in motion, reaching out to his lawyers to initiate the inheritance process. To him, his mother's silence was proof that his luck had finally come through. Arriving home with excitement barely contained, Brandon announced to Alex, "Pack your bags soon. We're finally going on that trip abroad, just like I promised." Alex looked up, her expression shifting from indifference to a faint, elegant smile. "Oh, about time. Not late exactly, but I was starting to lose faith in you, Brandon. We've been low on money for ages and you've barely moved an inch." Brandon shrugged, his confidence growing. "It's all in motion now. I just met with the lawyer. Soon I'll inherit everything." Alex's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Inheritance?" she echoed, leaning forward. "So, she's gone?" "You wouldn't believe it," Brandon replied, a grin spreading across his face. "But her friend practically told me so. She's either on her deathbed or already gone." Alex's face lit up with greedy satisfaction. "Brandon, there's so much money waiting. I can already see it." "That's what I'm talking about, baby," he replied, feeling triumphant. A month later, Brandon received a call from his lawyer, inviting him to the office to finalize the inheritance process. As he dressed in his best suit, Alex appeared in the doorway. "I'm coming with you," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I want to hear it with my own ears. I can't believe my dreams are finally coming true." She smiled, her voice trembling with anticipation. Brandon straightened his jacket, feeling a rare surge of pride, as if he were a real man capable of providing everything she desired. He looked at himself in the mirror, pleased with the sharpness of his suit. Alex stepped back, giving him an appraising look. "Honey," she remarked with a sly smirk, "you're so cruel. Your mother's dead, and here you are, dressed up like it's some celebration." Brandon waved her off, adjusting his collar with a smug smile. "It's her fault. I don't plan on wasting any time grieving. I just want to enjoy life." Alex shrugged, her tone light but mocking. "I suppose you're right. Just remember, people will always see you as the man with a mother who killed a pedestrian." Brandon scoffed. "Exactly. This money, this life, it's my compensation for all the suffering she put me through." Brandon tried to cut off the conversation, uncomfortable with the turn it had taken. "Let's go, Alex," he said, urging her to hurry as they drove to the lawyer's office. He was brimming with anticipation, already envisioning the future they could finally have. But his mood soured the moment he saw Cindy sitting in the office. Irritated, he briefly wondered if his mother might have left something to her in the will. However, the reality turned out to be far more intriguing than he had anticipated. After a brief greeting, the lawyer gestured for them to sit. Brandon expected to be handed a stack of documents to sign, but instead, the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Before we go over the paperwork, I have a short clip for you to watch." Brandon's irritation grew, and he huffed. "Can we skip this part? I'm here to finalize everything, not watch videos." The lawyer's expression didn't change. "Unfortunately, your mother specifically requested that you view the video first." With a reluctant sigh, Brandon slouched in his chair as everyone turned to the screen. His smirk quickly vanished when Jennifer appeared, alive and well, cradling a baby in her arms, smiling warmly at the camera. Is she alive? Brandon asked in disbelief, but the room remained silent. In the video, Jennifer looked directly at the camera, her expression calm and kind. Brandon, she began, her voice soft, I hope this message finds you well. I know you're a grown man now, living the life you wanted on your own terms. She took a deep breath, then continued. I served my time, your time in prison, and I made peace with it. But even after I was released, you didn't want anything to do with me. You made your choice, and I've made mine. If you didn't want me in your life, I figured there was no reason for you to use my money either. So I withdrew everything from the account. Brandon's eyes widened, his hands tightening on the edge of his chair. He glanced desperately at the lawyer, but the screen continued. But don't worry, Jennifer added with a gentle smile. I'm leaving you something. I arranged for a one-room apartment in the city. It's yours now. Good luck, son. She paused, her face softening with a mixture of sadness and finality. Be honest with yourself, and never let down those around you. Goodbye, Brandon. The screen faded to black. In the silence that followed, Brandon felt his entire world collapse. His breath hitched, and an anguished sob escaped his throat, raw and broken. He buried his face in his hands, shaking with grief and shame as the full weight of his actions settled over him. Without a word, Alex stood up, her face a mask of disgust and disappointment. She turned and walked out of the room, not sparing him a single glance. For the first time, Brandon felt the emptiness he had tried so hard to ignore, and the life he had gambled was now slipping through his fingers. Cindy couldn't hide her frustration with Jennifer. Even after all she'd been through, Jennifer still acted like a devoted mother, leaving her son something instead of walking away completely. Cindy couldn't understand it, yet she admired the strength in Jennifer's compassion. Meanwhile, across the country, Jennifer sat with someone who truly valued her, her new partner, Larry Garcia. Larry, who had once been her prosecuting attorney, had come to know Jennifer deeply during the process of gathering evidence for her retrial. He'd been astonished by her resilience and her immense heart, even after all she'd suffered. As the evidence mounted, it had become clear they could reopen her case and potentially overturn her conviction. But as her release date neared, Jennifer hesitated, torn by the thought of publicly exposing Brandon. Larry had tried to reason with her. Jennifer, he needs to face the consequences. You deserve justice, and he needs to be accountable. After many heartfelt conversations, Jennifer made her choice. She would leave Brandon alone and let him live his life as he'd chosen. Larry, recognizing the depth of her decision, agreed to respect her wishes, promising they would leave Brandon in the past. Larry himself was no stranger to betrayal and heartbreak. He'd been single since his own marriage had ended in painful circumstances. His ex-wife, also a lawyer, had cheated on him with a client. Jennifer's warmth and strength drew him in, and after her release he began to court her earnestly, respecting her need for time yet staying by her side. Their friendship blossomed, and they soon realized they wanted to build a future together. A year later, they welcomed a daughter, their new joy, and a symbol of the life they had both longed for. Jennifer found herself healing and grateful for the happiness she never thought she'd find again. Surrounded by love and peace, she felt blessed for the people in her life who had believed in her, especially Cindy, whose unwavering support and level-headedness had guided her through some of her darkest moments. Despite all she had endured, Jennifer felt hopeful and happy in her new life. With Larry by her side, she knew she could finally leave the past behind.